Hey, Aaron Chambers here. Welcome to this episode of Enjoy the Journey with Aaron Chambers. Hey, if you like my video podcast, if you'd give it a good rating and subscribe and share it, that would be really, really helpful. All right. And if you like my podcast, there's an audible version of every podcast, and you can find that wherever fantastic, amazing podcasts are played, including Apple Podcasts. Just search for Enjoy the Journey with Aaron Chambers. All right. This episode today is so helpful in this time of the coronavirus. Depression, anxiety, dread, and even suicidal thoughts are abundant and on the rise. And so today I talked to a counselor who has some incredible insights. His name's Steve Street, and he has so much wisdom. This is one of those episodes where I want you to have a pen and paper ready because you're going to take a lot of notes. There's some great practical advice and also timely advice. In this time of darkness, Steve shares a lot of light and hope through his wisdom. He has tons of experience, and I hope this experience helps you to enjoy the journey. All right. Hey, we are here with Steve Street. Steve Street is a licensed professional counselor and somebody I deeply respect. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. Hey, I wanted to talk with you because of your expertise in the area of mental health. But people who are listening to this or watching this, I'd like to know a little bit more about you. Just tell me a little bit about your background and what led you into this field you're working in.
Well, this is a second career for me. I was a pastor for a couple decades before this. Kind of a long personal story, but just felt like this was the next step for me to go into counseling and maybe take some of the informal counseling I did for years as a pastor and do it in a more official and specific manner. And so retooled and became counselor. Started that process about 10 years ago.
Okay, so let's talk about that for just a second, because I'm very fascinated with callings and how that works. And you're working as you were a worship pastor, correct?
Worship pastor and youth pastor.
Youth pastor too. That's right. That's right. And so when did you sense the calling into becoming a counselor?
So it was always the best part of ministry for me was always life on life, one-on-one, working with people. And that just seemed to be more and more aligned with who I am and how I saw my gifts and talents being used. Long story, but it was time to do something different. So it was either pack up and relocate somewhere else or do something different and stay in the same area. And that was the best thing for my family, to stay in the same area. And a lot of people along the way about that time were pointing that out in me, that those were kind of the skills and talents that I had.
So you've worked as a pastor, and you work now as a counselor. What do pastors need to understand more clearly about what it's like to work outside the church, and then vice versa? What do people who work outside the church need to understand about what it's like to work inside the church, since you've been in both places?
Interesting. I think one thing that people who don't work for the church maybe don't understand about pastors is the pressure pastors are under to be on all the time. Some people are really disillusioned when they see their pastor wearing jeans and a t-shirt on a Saturday. Just kind of the pressure to be in that role all the time, 24/7. And I think people who don't work in the church need to understand that pastors are people, and with lives and struggles and hopes and dreams and shortcomings, and to give them the space and the grace to be that. And I think pastors need to let themselves be that too, and understand that they are people and they're not on all the time, and that's not a realistic expectation, whether that expectation is on themselves or put on them by others.
Mm-hmm.
What pastors need to understand about working in the world, probably that people who have a more traditional job have a little less flexibility in their daily schedule and their time and some of the pressures that are put on them that maybe, I'm making an assumption, maybe a pastor has a little more control over than someone who works in the corporate world. Maybe not, depending on the ministry situation.
So working as a licensed professional counselor, as opposed to working within a church, what are some of the intrinsic differences, maybe even legally? Because, as a pastor, I do, pastoral counseling. And I know we have pastors listening to this podcast. So what is it that, the credentials that are required to do what you do as opposed to what a pastor does? And that being said, is there any caution you give pastors as far as the counseling aspect of what they do?
There are a lot of cautions I would give pastors. Counseling is one of the most highly regulated industries that there is, and I think that's appropriate because you're dealing with very sensitive issues in people's lives, and there should be a great deal of care about that. Different states have different laws and rules about who can counsel and how, whether even what you're doing is called counseling. So I think it's important for pastors to understand what their state calls counseling and who can do counseling. And if you're calling yourself a counselor or calling what you're doing counseling, you need to make sure that you are operating within the law. Not every state requires a license, but I believe most states require some sort of registration with the state under the regulatory agency if you're going to call it counseling. I work under a professional license, so I'm under even more scrutiny than pastoral counseling, which in some states is considered a separate category. And so I have to be very careful to abide by the laws that regulate my license so that I can keep my license.
Okay. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you is because of your wisdom when it comes to mental health issues. And there's been, in the past couple of years, for me as a pastor, some things that have caught my attention have been the stories of pastors who have, taken their life or have been started to be open about their mental health issues. And I've been just really interested in that as a pastor. And, I struggle with anxiety every once in a while and depression every once in a while. And I just been really tuned into mental health, my mental health, and then just mental health at large. But one of the things that I found, Steve, in my experience, it seems like there's a stigma associated with mental health. And when I go to get a physical, I don't feel any shame in that. But just being honest, if I go talk to a counselor, well, honestly, before the past couple of years, I would be, almost embarrassed to share that. Can you address that? Like you have a totally different perspective because you're in the business, but being a former pastor as well, the stigma thing, is that something that you see? Is it, am I overstating it or what?
Absolutely, there's a stigma. I think that's not exclusive to the church. I think there's a stigma with mental health counseling or mental health treatment across society. For someone to say, I am going to go see a counselor or go see a therapist, there can be a lot of fear or maybe even embarrassment about that. Unfortunately, I think that stigma, as hard as we are working to end that stigma, I sometimes think perhaps the church is behind the rest of society in ending that stigma. I think sometimes we talk about anxiety or depression or other mental health issues as if it's a moral failing or a moral shortcoming, and almost as if that reflects a lack of faith or some kind of sin or disobedience for a person of faith. And I don't believe it is. I think just as like you mentioned, just as you go to a medical doctor for a medical condition and no one seems to look down on you for that, we need to get there even within the church, and even encourage people to get the help they need.
Okay, so then what would you say to the person who means well, who is a believer who says, you know, if you're struggling with mental health issues, you just need to pray more or spend more time in the Word or whatever. Just what's your response to that?
So internally, I would think that person possibly has never struggled with those issues themselves, or maybe aren't honest about their own struggle with that. Um, I would also be thinking that perhaps that person is oversimplifying the issue. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we feel comfortable when we can put issues in little boxes. And, you know, I'm too blessed to be depressed. If we can put it in little boxes, especially with a rhyme, I can explain it and I feel good.
Yeah.
Until it touches you or until it touches a loved one. And then it's not so simple. And so I would encourage that person that prayer and being in the Word is certainly part of the healing, certainly part of the solution, but maybe they need some more help along that issue as well. So we're not discounting prayer. We're not discounting being in the Word. Um, that is certainly part of it, but sometimes someone needs a little more guidance along with that.
Is there some tool, resource, strategy that you find yourself using on a regular basis, and you just, as you're in the midst of it, you think God's hand had to be in this, or this is such a great tool. You know, I see God's hand in bringing this tool to my awareness, to into my tool bag, so to speak.
Oftentimes, you know, I had a pastor mentor talk with me a lot about what he called a trialogue, and he would share that as he was talking with somebody, he'd also be praying for the Holy Spirit's guidance along the way. So I'm talking to you, but I'm also talking to God, and God is showing me what to say, what to think, and I believe that's an important part of the process. I often I believe the Lord gives me visual images that seem to fit with that person's situation while we're talking, and I'll share that image with them, and it's spot on. And that's not for me. I'm not that smart or clever.
Okay, Steve, one of the things that's been in the news, like I said, is leaders who have taken their life or who have, you know, come out with and talked about their mental health struggles. What would you say to both the leaders and maybe the groups they're leading in regards to mental health?
So I talked about the leader always having to be on or feeling that pressure to always be on. And I think it's so important to have some relationships that are off stage. What I mean by off stage is these are people that you can truly be yourself with all your shortcomings and your doubts and your fears. Someone you can say, you know what, I hate being a leader today. I hate my job today. Or whatever you need to say, and this person is going to not dissolve because their illusion of you has been shattered, but this person who can be present with you and sit with you. It's probably going to be a relationship you've had for quite a while, someone who's known you well enough and long enough to not be impressed with your leadership position, so they can truly see you as a person, and to really have one or two or three relationships that you can be that authentic with, and that they can see you and hold that space with you. And we've got to encourage pastors and leaders to reach out for help, even if they need to see a counselor, that it's not a weakness, it's not a shortcoming, but that it's something that should be celebrated and encouraged. Maybe the church pays for it for their pastor, but we need to take that fear and shame out of going to see somebody. So maybe it's not somebody in your organization if you're not comfortable with that. Maybe it's in the next town over or in another church. But I think it's important to be able to find those people that you really can be real with, so you're not so isolated and not so feeling alone and carrying that pressure all by yourself.
So what would be some warning signs then? So, you know, talking to spouses, talking to people who serve on a board with a leader, what would be some warning signs that, wow, our leader might need to talk to somebody, or, you know, or my husband or my wife may need to talk to somebody?
So there's internal warning signs and external warning signs. Internal warning signs are something the person knows himself, just
Mm-hmm.
that sense of frustration or not enjoying something you used to enjoy, or a sense of hopelessness or a sense of lack of motivation. Those are things that probably are felt internally before someone else notices. External warning signs: are you seeing somebody who their temperament, their mood has changed? Maybe they're more irritable than usual, or maybe they're less patient than usual, and just seeing that they aren't seeming to handle things or cope with things as well as they used to. That might be an indication that they're needing some kind of support, they're needing some kind of help.
So I read an article this morning that from a medical group that suggested a rise. They're expecting to see a rise in suicides amidst this coronavirus and how it plays out in the aftermath of the quarantine and the sheltering. As you, Steve, as a professional, as you look at what we're doing with the sheltering and the social distancing and the quarantine, do you see, like, what cautions, what wisdom do you have moving forward? Like, do you have a, oh wow, I think we need to be looking out for this. Just as people who care about other people, coming out of this. What are some of the things you're like, oh, we need to be really looking at these? These would be bad signs.
One thing I've noticed with people is everyone's experience through this seems to be their total reality. In other words,
okay,
everybody has a perspective on what's going on, and that's the perspective that seems to be the most factual, make the most sense to them. And so I can talk to one person who says we need to stay on lockdown, stay in quarantine, we can't open things up because the health risk is too great to people, and they're fearful about reopening society too quickly, maybe introducing a second wave of the virus. And then the very next session, I can be having a conversation with somebody who is so fearful about losing their job that their perspective is, we have to open up, and I would rather risk getting sick than risk losing my job. I have a mortgage to pay, I have bills to pay, kids to feed. And both of those perspectives are so different and so real to those people that it's very difficult for, I think, people to see someone else's point of view. And that's a struggle for people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, with what you just said, some of the people who are listening to this podcast are pastors of churches, and as we record this, not all, most of the churches most states have not opened up for churches to come back in any way, let alone in full force. What would be your advice to pastors who are thinking about, and I want you to think, from a mental health perspective, what are some thoughts you have, some wisdom you have for pastors as they consider, the steps for opening up and starting to reintroduce in-person worship, congregational gatherings?
There are so many layers to this thing. As far as our responsibility to people, we have a responsibility to meet people's needs and to protect people. So to meet people's needs, providing them that fellowship, providing them that worship, providing them a chance to be together. That's the whole reason we gather as a church, and we don't just read and do things online, is we need that togetherness. And we have a responsibility to protect people. And so, even in considering reintroducing in-person appointments for my own practice, I have to think about, what am I doing to potentially put someone at risk? Am I potentially spreading the virus or putting someone at risk by having them in my office? I don't know the answer to those questions. I don't know how to balance giving people what they need and not putting people in harm's ways. And it's difficult because it seems the recommendations are changing rapidly, even daily.
So go ahead.
So we've got to find ways to get people connected in real and tangible ways. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what church with face masks looks like, or what church with people 6 feet apart looks like. I think pretty soon people are going to be zoomed out, and the video screen. I'm thankful for the technology. I can't imagine, had this happened 20 years ago, how even more disconnected we'd all feel. But it's not the real thing. It's it's a substitute, and I don't know at what point the substitute isn't going to be enough for people.
Okay, so with all that, so what would so any more advice for pastors in regards to trying to shepherd a congregation where half the people are ready to come back and greet each other with a holy kiss tomorrow, and half the people will not be back for months? They'll be wearing a mask and don't ever touch me again. Thank you very much. So, like, what's some wisdom there from a mental health perspective for pastors as we try to navigate that?
Well, like I said earlier, everyone's perspective on this issue to them seems like the perspective. It seems
Okay.
like the correct perspective. And so I think we have to offer a lot of grace for people to have a different perspective on this. There's a real potential for fear and shame to be brought into this equation. The truth is that, as if I understand it correctly, we don't really know what the right thing to do is yet.
Yeah.
And so for someone who thinks we should open the doors and let everyone come in, we need to be careful not to shame those people for their perspective. And for those who say, I'm not coming for 6 months, and when I do, I'm staying in my car with a mask on, we need to be careful not to shame those people as well. So if there's ever a time for grace, it's as we are navigating this thing together. And I think we need to remember that we are trying to figure this out together. This isn't a time to take sides and have the pro-maskers versus the anti-maskers.
Mm-hmm.
I just made that term up, but this isn't a time to take
Yeah.
sides. This isn't something the church should be divided on.
Yeah, I agree. And what you're saying is just grace. If you land on grace and avoid shaming those with whom you may disagree, and it's going to take so much grace getting through this whatever's next. Shame. You mentioned shame. Will you talk a little bit about the power shame has in our lives?
So I'm a big Brene Brown fan, so I'm going to steal a definition from her. And she defines shame as different than guilt. Guilt is I did wrong, and shame is I am wrong. So we have a mechanism. We have a mechanism when we're guilty for something we've done. As Christians, we have confession and forgiveness. In society, we have some form of reparation or restitution to do something with guilt we feel for what we've done. But when we've got this feeling of I am wrong, instead of I did bad, I am bad, or instead of I did wrong, I am wrong, there's often not a lot a person can do with that. And so they carry that, and that becomes this dark, heavy cloud that really can lead to depression or a sense of worthlessness or hopelessness.
Okay. And yeah, and I wonder the isolation and the because it's just so interesting. It's interesting that you as you talk about that, it's almost like this cultural shame. There's this. I'm trying to find the right word, Steve. But when you're at the store and you see someone not wearing a mask, or you look at somebody who's wearing a mask and you're wearing a mask, and they don't make eye contact with you, and their heads are down. There's just this. I wonder what role shame is playing right now in what we're going through, and then moving forward.
And I think with that, shame goes hand in hand with fear. So I think part of the reason we are taking sides on what to do next in this whole situation is partly driven by fear.
Mm-hmm.
I'm afraid of catching this disease, so shut everything down and wear a mask. I'm afraid of losing my job, so open everything up and quit telling me what to do. I think some of those responses can be driven by fear. And when we're fearful, we tend to react negatively toward those who are reacting differently. So if I'm quarantining and masking because I'm afraid, I'm going to react differently to someone who says, open the doors, let's go back in. And so with that shame, I can want to shame somebody who sees things differently than I do,
Hmm.
or I may feel shame because I feel differently than they do. But I think sometimes the fear and shame go hand in hand.
Okay, fear. So fear is, it's been abundant since this all came down. What are some healthy things we can do with the fear that, because some people are listening to this are not afraid at all, and other people are just don't want to get out of bed. And I shared yesterday in my message at Journey that early on I was overcome with fear, and I lost 14 pounds and didn't want to get out of bed. So as a professional, what are some healthy things we can do in the face of fear? Because it's not, I don't mean, yeah, we may be used to it a little bit now, but I think fear is going to be something we're going to deal with no matter what, different levels. So what is your professional advice, wisdom when it comes to dealing with fear?
I think, our thoughts precede our feelings. Fear is a
Wait,
feeling.
that was brilliant. Say it one more time. Our
Our
thoughts.
thoughts precede our feelings.
Okay, if you're listening, you need to write that down. That's really insightful. Okay, I'll let you finish. Sorry.
So fear is a feeling.
Okay.
And so when we are feeling fearful, it's helpful to pay attention to what we're thinking. And part of what we're thinking has to do with what we're taking in. When this thing first started, I found myself watching a lot of news. And if you watch a lot of news, you're just going to be hearing a lot of alarming things and a lot of frightening statistics. And realized pretty early on, I've got to limit my news consumption. I've got to limit how much I'm watching this, or I am going to be fearful. And we need to replace some of those fearful thoughts with more positive, hopeful things. So maybe less news, more worship music.
Okay, so Steve, yesterday I shared in my sermon that I was, dealing with fear and anxiety and dread, when this all started. And before I delivered my very first message to an empty room, I was backstage laying on the floor, not sure I could do it. Okay, so this is a very important issue to me, a very real issue to me. What I want to get some advice from you, some wisdom from you, like as to what leaders can do to start healthy and productive conversations about mental health in their organizations, because there may be people listening who are leading, men and women who are leading organizations who say, I have no idea. Because there is shame associated with this, because there is fear associated with this, I have no idea how to even begin to start the conversation to find out if any of my employees or staff are struggling.
We talked about removing the stigma of mental health issues and getting mental health treatment if necessary. And I think that starts with the leader. If the leader, the leader's language about mental health is going to influence the organization. So if the leader speaks positively about seeking treatment or seeking support, that's going to open up a sense in the organization that, oh, this is okay. If the leader struggles with depression or anxiety and is honest with that, not that you have to bare your soul and tell all the intimate details about what's going on, but just to say, sometimes I struggle with anxiety. There's a lot of leaders who won't say that. There's a lot of organizations where that's not allowed to say. And that puts the shame, that puts that covering of secrecy and silence over that issue for someone who is struggling with it. So for the leader to say, this is real and it's okay to deal with this, even if I have to deal with, even I deal with this, if that's true and necessary, that makes it okay for those words to be spoken in that organization, and that starts to take that stigma off.
Okay, that's so practical. I hope people are taking notes because this is so practical. We're going to wrap up here in just a couple more questions. Steve, what kind of end where we began? What is something, if there's a pastor or a leader and he or she they're listening to this and they are just feeling overcome with depression or anxiety or dread, like what specifically would you say to them as we're listening right now?
I would say find somebody who is unimpressed enough with your title that you could be real with. Find somebody who's not going to see you as pastor so-and-so or C-suite leader so-and-so, but someone's going to see you as Tom or Mary or someone who needs help, and someone you can really just say, here's where I am, here's what I'm struggling with. Secrets grow in the dark. just putting that out there with somebody safe enough to be authentic with, is a good step toward figuring out what your next step may be. Maybe just talking with that person is enough. Maybe in talking with that person, you may realize, I actually do need to see someone on a professional level. But start the conversation with somebody who can handle hearing it from you. There are people that can handle hearing it from you.
Okay, that's good, practical advice. All right, hey, so the name of this video podcast and audio podcast is Enjoy the Journey. And so I like to ask at the end, what's one thing that brings joy to your journey, Steve?
On a professional level, just those moments each day when I'm able to help somebody and somebody has that aha moment, where something we're talking through makes sense to them and they're able to take a step forward to being more healthy emotionally for themselves. That's exciting to see. On a personal level, just remembering that in all of this craziness, God is still on the throne. God's still in control. God is the God who sees.
Mm-hmm.
He knows what's going on.
Okay, Steve, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. And I'm so grateful for your time and for your wisdom. And I'm eager for people to hear this because there's so much practical stuff. So Steve Street, thank you so much. And you're a blessing. And I appreciate you so much.
Thank you.